So should I continue? Okay. You gonna help me with it? No. Okay. So this evening's Dharma talk, there you are, is titled 5 Dharmas of the Lankavatara. The 5 Dharmas of the Lankavatara Sutra, a particular teaching that I've talked about before, and it seems to be, for some people, comes in pretty handy for laying this kind of you could call it a grid on everything that's happening and breaking it down into parts so it's easier to understand. Just like when we look at the sense of self, me, one of the ways to break down this so you can see that it's just a collection of things coming together that looks like a self, looks like a me. This is why we use the model of the 5 skandhas, or the 5 heaps: form, feeling, perception, concept, consciousness. And the suggestion there is to take any one of those, or a couple of them, and go in and see if you can find an identity there. See if consciousness can say, okay, the self is in the feeling, or the self is in the form, or the self is in the concept, conceptualization or formations, and so on. And so by using the 5 dharmas of the Lankavatara Sutra, they're simply put is, the first one is something arises, something occurs, something happens, and we, instead of just watching and just seeing it, just seeing what arises, we name it. And then instead of just naming it, then we go to the 3rd dharma, and we explain it, or define it, or characterize it, or make exceptions about it, or some kind of spinning around that to make it more elaborate. It's because of this that's happening, or if I hadn't done this, that wouldn't be occurring. And all of the various things that we do, we all experience this in our lives in different ways, different forms. Those are the first 3. And if you let yourself get wound up in that, then you'll go from, then the next thing will arise, then you'll cause something to arise, and then that arises, and then we name that, and you could name it this, that, this is anger, and then we add on to why the anger is there, and then it just gets more and more elaborate. And the self-centered mind, the ego mind, is drawn into that whirlwind, or into that circularity, that merry-go-round of going here and going there and going here, around here and around there, looking like, as you've heard me say before, and maybe you can relate to this and maybe not, looks like a straight line. Looks like we're getting somewhere somehow. The sitting practice of meditation, the study of the Buddha's Dharma, is about awareness. So it's about awareness of that process, awareness of it, and that awareness seems to involve watching the way we are conditioned to join in. We're drawn into some kind of something magnetizes us into that. It could be fear, it could be hope, it could draw us into that. It's the basic teaching of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths. Life is difficult, or suffering, or compromised, or irritating, or negative. And then we, as the Buddha said, the reason that happens is we want something else to happen. Something happens, we don't want that, we want something else. So this tends to cause a circularity that can be, according to the Four Noble Truths, can be seen more clearly by training the mind, the 4th Noble Truth of the path. The goal is, the 3rd Noble Truth is cessation, or the end of that circularity. There's ways of talking about it, and anytime we use concepts, we always fall short of what we're endeavoring to point at. So sometimes it takes some contemplation of the concept to see the way in which that works, to actually use it as a stepping stone to step into the awareness. You could say it that way. So if through the sitting practice of meditation, through our awareness by observing and watching, not interfering with it. That's a misunderstanding. If you interfere with it, you'll succeed. Or if you interfere with it, you'll fail. Or if you interfere with it, you'll ignore what happens. Passion, aggression, and ignorance. So don't do anything with it. Always the awareness has priority. That's why the Buddha is awake. He was aware. The word Buddha means to be awake, aware. So the next two are characterized differently depending on which teaching it is. And say number 4 would be Suchness, or it could be Buddha knowledge, 2 ways of translating Sanskrit words, and I'm not sure what they are. And sometimes they seem to be opposite. It seems like Suchness comes first and Buddha knowledge later, or Buddha knowledge might come first. You might understand this conceptually, see how this is working, before you have some kind of an awakeness or a direct perception of Suchness, which is without a self and without an other. You could also start to have that perception and look around for how to understand that. You might have that and not know what it is, and you might tend to want to look towards some kind of conceptual understanding that would show up as knowledge. So something arises, we name it, we add on to it, we comment on it, we modify it in some way, think about it, accept it, reject it, ignore it, and that continues. Then something else arises, and then we continue to go around through those first 3, using those concepts in order to understand what is occurring. If one sits down and holds still, very simply put, train the mind. And also when we study the concepts, to actually use the concepts that have already been discovered and understood from ancient times and from recent times. As Trungpa Rinpoche or Kobun Roshi or other contemporary teachers that are endeavoring to present the Buddha's Dharma. It seems to be necessary to begin to understand that as a teaching, and then to make some kind of a commitment to oneself. You don't need to make it to me or to anyone else, but make some kind of a commitment to you're actually going to do this. You're not going to make it a kind of a hobby thing. Nothing wrong with hobbies.
The first 3 of the 5 dharmas seem to be progressive, and I'm wondering if there is a progressive quality to the 4th and 5th. Is that you go 1 through 5?
If one begins to look at, contemplate, understand the first 3 and begins to use those as a way of understanding just basically what's happening. Something happens, we name it. It's a toaster, it's a window shade, it's a negative feeling, it's jealousy, name it. It's depression, we name it, and then we elaborate on that on top of that. The name is the first way that we ignore with the motive of understanding or grasping or controlling something. Very difficult to sit down and receive negative emotions and feelings and so on without some attribution, even as little as I'm feeling like crap. That's extra. And we, you, I, me, we all might have to do a lot of that before we eventually, it occurs to us, you could say it that way, it occurs to us that we're actually adding something on top of the very thing we're trying to understand. We're actually putting something on it that gives us maybe the feeling, because of the imputation that there is a separate person who's observing, or there's some kind of experiencer, then we somehow feel an automatic justification to abandon what's arising by labeling it, by you actually keep it at a distance by calling it something. You separate yourself from it. And to make a little story about it, maybe not doing that might feel like not knowing what that is, and then the awareness, because you haven't put some kind of a conceptual 4th skandha, barrier up, your awareness actually can go down into that labyrinth, or that darkness, or or all of those tributary streams flowing in the darkness. You might begin to get an idea of what those are from a point of view of awareness. Pardon me. Michael.
What's going on in the fourth skandha when that doesn't happen, when you're not labeling what you're trying to look at?
The label may come up, but it doesn't join up with anything else. The label may show up, but it's just appearing. You follow me? So it drops out of it doesn't end up in the third, or the second one of naming, or the elaboration part of it. It actually stays with what's arising. So it's just something arising. Good question. Thank you. I couldn't have said that without the question. Good one. Yes?
If we see that we're doing the naming and the explaining, are all those potentially just something arising?
Yeah, it's just phenomena coming and going, coming and going. If there's any agenda added onto it, which is quite often what happens in the third, is I've got to stop doing this. I can't feel this way anymore. I don't like this feeling. I don't want to be this person. We've all had a little bit of experience. Your version might be different than the person next to you, or maybe than mine. But we have to actually, and I say this over and over and over again, have to be genuine. You have to meet yourself where you're at. You're going to have trouble meeting other people where they're at, because you're not going to, however they act, you're not going to be okay with that. You're not going to like what they do, because there's lots of people out there. So first you have to make friends with this. When you was there today when I made friends with the guy at the... So this is not a setup where suddenly you have to act a certain way. Nor otherwise, there's no parameter for anything. You have to be who you are and what you are at any given time. And to ego, that doesn't work too well, because the ego has something that you have to live up to. And if you're always looking at some kind of a standard that you have to live up to, then there'll be this little interlocutor there that will say, you shouldn't be doing that. Oh, you shouldn't be doing that. Question?
I was wondering, what is the distinction between Buddha knowledge and suchness?
So I don't know, from whoever wrote the Lanka or whatever team of gurus got together and did that. But the way it shows up for me is suchness is just a direct perception that there isn't anything else but this. There isn't anything else. So there's always just this. As it says on the little scroll back, as it is. Just as it is. That's a simple way of putting it. And it's not a conclusion. It's not an elaboration. It's just a way of moving from direct perception into a statement about it. And it's kind of a homely statement. It's just as it is. Just this. Just as it is. And so the Buddha knowledge might be more like understanding that, or understanding the five dharmas and the way that works, and actually be able to see the way that works in all the time, but watch that moving. So there'd be knowledge of how that structure works, and you might be going through something very similar to what the Buddha went through when he was on his path before there was some awakening. My understanding is that either one could happen. If suchness comes first, then you might be in a big jam.
Does the Buddha knowledge, can that be distinguished from our regular conceptual mind?
So I would say it's distinguished from it in that the conceptual mind has some kind of built-in, I like it, I don't like it, or it's a good thing or a bad thing, or I'm thinking clearly or I'm not thinking clearly, or I'm able to analyze this or understand this deeply, or I'm not able to, and all of the conclusions that are happening there. Whereas Buddha knowledge wouldn't necessarily be a conclusion. Of course, you could say, well, the Four Noble Truths, aren't those conclusions? Yes, but those are provisional teachings. And so suchness is not a provisional teaching. It's just a way of talking about something that is ineffable, or impossible to describe. We're actually, as practitioners, as meditators, we're in the three-dimensional, four-dimensional, whatever world of human realm, passion, aggression, ignorance, the difficulty with this and difficulty with that, and our relationships, our jobs, our interactions with others. The state of affairs in the world is outlandishly crazy. It's insane. It's, from the point of view of a continuing living situation, it's quite threatening. Ah, the light doesn't work. Hmm?
It's not plugged in.
Oh, it's not plugged in.
Therefore, the light doesn't work.
So that arose, I named it, and then I projected onto it that the light didn't work, and you corrected me. I like that. Yes?
I'm still trying to understand how the first three can go into the fourth one. So if we see the naming and the explaining, it seems like it resolves into just something arising. How does that become suchness, or how does that work together?
So the thing that arises, and the naming is something that arises, and the elaboration is something that arises. So we see those are all arising. So they're not separate from each other. They look separated because it looks like one is this is the name of that, and this is the explanation of what that means. So it creates a circularity, like a thought pattern that comes to conclusions about this and about that, and tends to, through some kind of a story or metaphor, starts to separate ourselves out from everything, and that can get very dense and very elaborate, especially if there's some kind of pain coming out of it, or some kind of loss coming out of it, or some kind of fear coming out of it. Then that tends to promote that circularity. So when we bring all of that into an environment like this, where the intention here is to sit down, hold still, and find out who you are, and look, we have to look at our own craziness in order to really be sane. We might have to look at some difficult stuff, but it's kind of a setup where we can do that. We have a space. No one ever plays basketball in here. No one ever gambles, I don't think. Probably not. But it's meant for this. If you come in here and meditate, because people have been doing this for many, many years now, you can actually feel it. I don't know if that's just something somebody's making up or imagining or whatever, but it's pretty strong. Much different to sit here and facing a wall than to go somewhere else, or perhaps not. Maybe different for different people. But it's about watching that without adding to it. And eventually you begin to see that all three of those, or maybe 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever's happening, are just arising. You just see that they just are showing up. And they're not, and that not showing up, if you do nothing with it, then it doesn't mean it won't continue to show up, but you will eventually understand that you're not actually separate from what is showing up. You're something that's showing up too. Yes.
That's what I wanted to ask about. Is there the progression or process, how the self and ego, I don't know if it's just synonymous or if it's, but how that arises?
How the self-centeredness
Self or ego. Is self and ego
Yeah.
identical?
Well,
Are
it's
they part of a
spoken of
process?
different ways, but any kind of solid identity comes out of fear.
Is there a process to it? Is there a progression like
There's
you
the
described?
tradition. The traditional one is the 12 links in the chain of existence. First, there's just an open dimension where nothing much is going on, and then there's a kind of a spinning happens, and then there's what's called a vidya, or ignorance, and then there's out of that comes. This is just someone's way in ancient times of looking at this structure, and probably more than one person, and describing the different stages that this happens in. But how it actually happens might not slow down enough for you to actually conceptualize it. So there's ignorance, the ignoring of the open space, which causes this, just like I think I might have been saying to you earlier, if I'm looking at the candle, I'm ignoring you. Didn't I say that to you?
Mhm.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the candle, It's not a deliberate ignorance, it's a distraction. I'm distracted by this, so therefore I ignore everything else. So we get distracted by that, things start to spin, and then we start to solidify and think there is some being, there's someone, and that happens, I think it's what's the fourth one is name and form. Is that it? Am I counting right here? So name and form are the 5 skandhas. And so that's when there starts to be formed somebody who is somebody, who's a person, and then there's a contact with any one of the 6 sense fields. That's the last, the 6 senses is the last skandha. Then there's contact with apparent other, and then there's a feeling about it, which will be positive, negative, neutral, or other nuances, and then we either don't want it, which is aggression, or we want it, which is passion, or we don't want to be bothered by it, which is ignorance. And so that creates further havoc called samsara, further spinning. This is just a simple way of breaking it down. This has been going on from beginningless time, incarnation after incarnation. You don't need to really remember your last life. It wasn't actually yours, this is your life. The ownership part is gone, so therefore everything is living and dying all the time. And it just shows up as somebody. More? So the idea is to see it. The idea is to be aware of it, and that's why it's difficult, because what you're experiencing now as your mind for the last 3 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours, 8 years, what you're experiencing, the various pluses and minuses, however you'd say about it, comes from unsearchable sources. You can't find the first source, and it's so complicated, incredibly complicated, so you can't track it down. So what the ego will do is settle for praise and blame. So it'll back out of the complication that can't know, because it doesn't like not knowing. It wants to be somebody who knows. So it'll go in a direction, and it'll clamp down on things. They're called opinions. It'll take things that are in motion and just solidify them. And this is there's a passion there, there's aggression there, and there's also a profound ignorance that causes us to ignore others, ignore the plight of others, and just focus on our own comfort. There are lots of ways that shows up. I mean, almost as many ways as there are human beings. And we in this room, or anyone who's tuning into this, I may be helpful in this area, and I may not. I may have to look around for someone else. I'm not here to promote myself particularly. On the other hand, if what I say makes sense, then listen to the next thing I'm going to say. Find out yourself. How do you do that? You don't have to come this way necessarily, but if you want to find out, you're going to have to slow way down. The speediness of the mind will keep that rotating until the 5 skandhas leave the 6 realms and go back into the elements, 5 elements, 6 elements, however you count them, and go back into earth, fire, water, and air, or earth, water, fire, and air. And the consciousness goes with it. So what is there to reincarnate? Go ahead.
A question from Shoshi over in Vicksburg.
I know him.
He asks, are you teaching out of ignorance?
Of course. I don't know anything. Yes.
What is the fear before we name it?
Yeah. Find out. It's the fear of an open dimension where you don't know. The ego wants to know something, and it'll settle. So the ego, all you have to do is say, well, that's just this. Well, that's just her, that's just him. But if you can bring yourself or train yourself to not jump to any conclusions, don't include anything, and rather than include or exclude anything, actually include the very fear that comes up. Include it. And how do you include it? Look right at it. And to cover it up with a name, even to call it fear, is to begin to cover it up. It's necessary to experience the color green without knowing what color it is, simply put. Yes?
What does it mean to teach out of ignorance?
You don't know what you're talking about. in the common traditional sense. I couldn't do this. I'm not very smart. That's not some kind of false modesty or anything. I'm really not. But I'm extremely stubborn, and I decided I was going to find out what this was if it ended my life. Go ahead.
Could you say what it is that's being ignored?
When?
Like when you're teaching out of ignorance?
That's a good question. You're ignoring the apparent separation that ego propounds. Keep going.
I was trying to.
You won't be able to make any sense out of what I'm saying because I don't make sense. I don't make any sense. Danny,
How can we meet someone where they're at if we're projecting onto them?
just see that you're projecting. You don't have to change it. You don't have to be artificial about it. You don't have to pretend something else. You have to see very clearly you're projecting. It can be painful to do that because you're actually feeling, you could be even feeling the very fear that they're refusing to feel. More?
If we can't recognize exactly what that projection is, do we need to look at it more?
I'd say so. Just be persistent. Just don't give up. Keep going. Keep looking at it. The more, from the point of view of the spiritual path, the more we feel kind of at a loss, or are we ever going to get anywhere? I've been meditating. I've been here for years, and I'm practicing and practicing, and I still feel like a dud. What is that? Which Dharma is that? Second and third. The first one is I. The second one is dud. No, the third one is dud. Anytime we elaborate on anything, it's not that the elaboration doesn't have some relative truth. That's why it gets a pass. That's why it gets in the gate. That's why you can have conversations with people about the people that don't practice. You can have conversations about them, and they'll reinforce your ignorance, your opinions, your ideas, your conclusions over and over because that's what they want you to do for them. So,
We saw some people yesterday that aren't practitioners, and it seems to be common going back to see family or something like that. There's some kind of subtle anxiety or fear that even comes up. Is it possible to see if it's coming from somebody else or ourselves?
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to find who's doing what to who. That's a trap. The ego wants to know that so that it can either blame itself or blame the other. And I'm not talking about some kind of overt blaming, but just, well, it's because of me. Or, well, it's their problem. Mm-hmm.
So what is it when you talk about we might be feeling someone's fear that they're not looking at themselves?
Again?
I think you said something to Danny to that effect, where we might be registering or picking up on something that somebody else isn't looking at. So
Yes.
what is that?
It's fear. I'm not saying it's their fear necessarily. Like their fear is kind of, it's not getting respected and it's getting shut down, so it's kind of floating through the ether and it's coming into you. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying it's not separate. And then the no separation can be experienced in lots of different ways. And one of the ways it can be experienced as being with someone who is fearful and is covering that up and acting kind of arrogant or like a know-it-all. But if you've practiced yourself for a while, you've been looking at your own fear, maybe you haven't dealt with that very directly. Maybe you're still working with that. Maybe you're still trying to understand that. But because you've been working with it for a while and with a sense of openness and curiosity and a willingness to go into the situation, otherwise you couldn't come in this meditation hall, this Zendo, over and over and over, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and continue to do something that does not produce some kind of gain. And that's what you're doing when you're here. There's no, the kind of gain that comes about is not something you can say, take to the bank. So when you see someone like that, you can feel their fear. You may experience it as fear in yourself, or you can maybe feel really sad for them, or you might actually begin to feel the fear that they're feeling, and it might not be exactly that fear, but it's because of the lack of separation between people. There's a lot of things happening that aren't just coming out of the vocal cords and going into the ears. Yeah, just go anywhere where someone is your family or whatever, and talk to somebody with a sense of openness about what's happening with them, and you'll see that they're just jumping back and forth in between different kinds of positions about just anything to protect themselves from the reality that everything is going to come to an end. And you don't go the other way around and say, come to some kind of conclusion that you don't care if everything comes to an end. We're not talking about that. I am talking about not taking a position on anything. And the only way we can do that is to see the way we continue to take positions. Questions are good if you have them. Kyun?
Predispositions, kind of like nerve endings for our thoughts.
What? Let me repeat it. Our predispositions, kind of like nerve endings for our thoughts. Say more about that.
Well, are they sticky for a certain reason that brings up thoughts?
Yeah.
Mind.
Yeah. Might be something in there that makes that whole area more complicated, that draws us into some kind of imaginary presumptions about things that has to do with the nerve endings or the feeling about something before it starts to show up as some kind of concept about something. Is that what you're asking about?
And then with karma, is that give everyone an individual type assessment or not assessment? I guess, yeah, the predisposition of.
Don't think out loud, guys.
Too much thinking.
It's confusing.
Too much.
No, I'm really confused. Any question?
Earlier today, you said something like, there's no doer, but things still get done. Can we practice not being a doer?
You can watch the way things occur and see if there's someone doing that. So watch. I mean, it's obvious when you begin to practice that. Of course, it's always like, well, of course, there's somebody doing this. There's somebody touching the fan. There's somebody putting their hands together. Of course, there's somebody else over there adjusting their robe or something. So but just continue to look at it as it is. And you could use the 5 dharmas. You know, something occurs. We name it. Something's happening, and then we respond to it in a way of I'm doing it, or they're doing it, or it's somebody else is doing it. It's the way consciousness appropriates through the 5 skandhas some kind of a being who is doing everything, who is responsible for everything, some kind of central authority, central bureaucracy that is, the Trungpa Rinpoche used that metaphor of ego. And yes, you can see that there's not anyone doing anything. Something is happening, but there's no individual doing it.
Does the doer come into play in between the first and second dharmas? So if something arises.
Yeah, it could show up anywhere.
Where does the name come from if there's no namer?
like that. Where does it come from? Find out. Where does the name come from? Where does the thought come if there's no thinker? Where does the feeling come from if there's no feeler? That's an area that bring your awareness into that, and with that kind of questioning. Yes, sir.
How can we bring our awareness to that area?
See that you can't. See that you fail at doing it. It's just an area that there's no, this whole success and failure area, I got it, I didn't get it, that kind of area gets, the whole polarity situation starts to collapse. And this is when ego starts to panic. It's not getting a reference point out of it. I'm panicked all the time. Don't I look panicked? Everybody looks very somber. Why would I say that? What's that about? That's a rhetorical question you should answer. Yes.
There's or there was at least last time I was reading this stuff, sort of a movement in cognitive science to think about cognition as not being necessarily centered on an individual body-mind, being distributed.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that thinking happens inside one body-mind?
As opposed to many body minds or outside of the body?
As opposed to, so I'm just thinking about what I read in cognitive science, but like the example was how a cockpit in an airplane thinks. So there's there's obviously a pilot and a co-pilot, and they have thoughts, but there's all these other instruments and tools and part of the material environment that are part of the cognitive, at least cognitive process, which I'm not saying is the same as thinking. But
What's the question?
so would you say that thinking happens just inside a single, I mean, I'm wondering if thinking is possible without a particular body mind.
Yes. And I would go a little further and say both. Both in the cockpit and out in space. It doesn't have a location based on our relative understanding of solidity, this being here and not being over there. Can't actually find thoughts. Everybody experiences thoughts, but you can't actually see them. And if you use I was telling somebody recently about alternating, going between sense of touch, sense of seeing, and a sense of thinking. If you do alternating sense awareness practice, just go between that little triangle right there. You'll find that when you go into the area of thinking that you don't see anything. I mean, you might, but it might take a while. But you'll go in there and it doesn't feel like I'm thinking anything. You won't just go in there and suddenly you're thinking about the laundry. Now you're going back to this color of the texture of the wall. Then you're going back to gravity, how this feels. And you're going back to thoughts. Probably won't find much there. Yes?
What does that show us when we try to move to that sense consciousness and it seems to be so evasive?
So you agree that it's evasive?
It seems to be.
What does it look like to you?
Just using that example of the alternating sense awareness practice, that seems to be the one I don't really know where to go to. Like vision or sight, that seems to be pretty agreeable where that's pointing to.
The sight one is the one that everything that reinforces the I'm here and everything else is over there. The conceptual mind does that more abstractly. And then the hearing, that's also, you hear something that's over there, it's the fan, it's over there, but it's more intimate. Taste, of course, is extremely intimate. Smell is very intimate. Touch, can be intimate. But seeing is distant. It's actually more aligned with the thinking process, because thoughts are distant.
A question from Karen in New Zealand. She asks, where is awareness coming from if there is no I, no self?
That's where it's coming from. It's coming from that open dimension. So what am I saying? I'm saying you can't find a source for that. You can't find a place where that's coming from. So it may be more accurate to just say it's coming from no self. But there's no actual production of it. Nothing is being produced. It feels like we're thinking. It feels like I'm thinking about, well, I've been thinking about that, but it's not exactly happening that way. There's a lot less volition happening there than it sometimes looks like.
What's happening with contemplation? Or is that of our own doing?
If you're contemplating what you're going to make for dinner, like you're meditating, you're thinking about noodles. So what's the question about?
Does that come? Are we able to direct what we think about through intention?
Yeah, a little bit. There's a little bit of intention around it, but it doesn't have the power to really kind of continue to hold on to some kind of a thinker and a thought and some kind of identity structure for a while, but not for very long. Identity is constantly changing, discontinuous. So we solidify it by believing in this and not believing in that, and having positions and ideas and judgments and opinions on everything, including I am thinking about this or thinking about that.
I don't really know how to ask it, but is it the same with an intention? We just impute that we're the ones intending it?
Looks that way. We have an intention to do something, and we, at the same time, this is what we're going to do, that's the object, and this is the one who's doing it. So, and that's reinforced, of course, by the whole form, the five skandhas, the body, and feeling, perception, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. Form, and then how we feel, and then the conceptual connection comes in and takes whatever's happening and gives it some kind of conceptual structure. Could be aligned with, I don't like that because of this and this and this, or she shouldn't be doing that, she knows better, those kind of structures, and so on. So it's not about stopping all that and not doing it. It's about seeing that there's not a solid being in there anymore. There's no solid person. Yes.
Is there intention? Is it possible for there to be intention without grasping?
I think there can be. That also can be in hot pursuit. But I think there can be an intention there without any kind of demand.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your word. It could be an odd pursuit?
There could be an intention there without any demand.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So we intend to do this, but if it goes the other way or goes south and doesn't work, then there's not a particular disappointment happening, like or adding on to that we're a failure or it didn't work out or better luck next time. Come on, you guys, help me with this.
the intention of using these 5 dharmas would be to stay with the arising, or is that an intention?
So I would think that if you were using these to contemplate those, that might be something you would move into, but not particularly locked down on, because you're using, something arises, so that's the first thought, best thought situation. Something arises as it is. And something else might arise that covers that up, like a name, or like for instance the one that I've used as an example before. Something arises, we feel depressed, we feel we have a really negative feel, we wake up feeling very negative about something, and rather than just be with the negativity, watch the negativity, we want to do something with it. We want to give it a name, so we call it depression. And just the act of calling that emotion depression stops any investigation of it, or any awareness going into that to see fundamentally what it is. So therefore, it gets to keep its little disguise. Whereas if you just feel it, it may not feel so good, but all of that is dependently arisen, but you're no longer turning away from it. So this is what I feel. This is what Trungpa Rinpoche was talking about when he recommended to his students, including this person, be genuine. But don't run away or try to be some other person who has no negative thoughts or has no. Just be the emotions that arise. Just be that. Allow yourself to actually experience that. This is what the sitting practice of meditation, Shikantaza, will eventually move you into doing that more and more in your interactions with others. You'll be present. You might not know, might feel like you don't know, you might know less and less of what's actually going on, but you might, if you look at it closely, you might see that you're actually in the room you're in. You're with the people you're with. But you're not, your mind isn't going off on some kind of excursion about anything. Going out and abandoning everybody so you can think about it, or judge it, or evaluate it, or accept it, reject it, or meddle with it in any way. Yes?
If it appears that something has arisen, is ego already there or being believed in?
Not necessarily. Something arises, and then there's some kind of an adjustment to it. We do something with it instead of it just shows up, and even if we do something with it, it's about being aware that we're doing something with it rather than trying to stop that. That's where it becomes challenging for our self-centered mind, because we get drawn into that kind of an agenda. Well, I've got to do something about this. Well, I can't just little tiny mini lectures. Well, I can't just let this go on. I had a good experience of that today at the township. It's a great situation for me, because I don't find myself in that situation. I'm not around horrible people very much. I'm around a room full of angels. Not a compliment. But in that situation, I'm with people who are quite insane, and I'm not separate from them. So I'm functioning in that dynamic. I'm not trying to be somebody else, like, oh, I can't be mad. No, I was mad. I was irritated in that situation, and I showed it without apology. I'm not justifying, I'm just saying that's just how it functioned. I watched it function. I'm not in control of anything. Yes, sir?
What's doing the drawing in that situation?
What's doing what?
The drawing. You said you're drawing in. What's drawing?
I said I'm drawn what?
Drawn in. So what's doing the drawing? Like,
The situation. It's situational. Anytime, all of you have been in the Hojo at some time or another and talked to me about something, I'm drawn into your situation. Not that I'm some kind of blank slate or something. I have all kinds of things happening here too, but you come in and present this, or this, and I'm with you. I hear you. I'm talking to you about that situation. And I may give you some advice, I may not. Yes?
If it's seen that there's no separation, can things still appear to arise?
Of course. That's why it's so difficult, because the assumption is, well, if I really train my mind and I have some kind of success on the path, as they say, I begin to see what the nature of reality is, that somehow all the, as like it sometimes says in the provisional teachings, that all that goes away. I'm here to tell you that that's not exactly what they mean. But they have to tell you something. So what are they going to tell you? You're going to be miserable forever. I'm the only one who's going to tell you that. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of funny in a way, but on the other hand, it's the truth. You have to have the truth, rather than some kind of creation of something that we finally accomplished. Go ahead. I can see the question all over your face.
Is there something different about the arising?
Yes. It's not, you're not separate from it anymore. So you're just, the separation's gone. You may still have arising, you may still have naming, may still have comments on it, you may have suchness, you may have Buddha nature. That structure is to help you move your awareness towards the deep, true understanding of the nature of this. But it tends to come apart in the sunshine. So it won't hold up. And so by not holding up, it also doesn't go away, because it's the very nature of everything, very nature. It's unborn, unceasing with a nature like the sky, like clouds in the sky, like frogs in a pond, mice in a treehouse. Can you come up with a really good metaphor? When I die, you're going to be up here coming up with metaphors. Don't use the mouse one. Yes, sir.
What believes the ego is real?
What?
What believes that the ego is real?
What believes? Oh. Well, the simple response, of course, is the ego believes that he goes. But it's I think it's the constant appearance of otherness. Something this, something there. There's something there, so there must be somebody here seeing that. That kind of constant imputation of there's someone, just because I'm here and I'm seeing you over there must be somebody here seeing that, someone over there. So this is why the teaching of the Yogacara teaching, or of perception only, is so powerful. That if you can see that yes, there's a perceiver in a sense, and there's an object in a sense, but the fundamental situation is just the perception itself, rather than the object, or rather than some kind of imputed perceiver of it. Yes.
Thinking, a lot of times you use a dynamic like thinking thinks, feeling feels. Does the same thing hold up for imputing imputes?
Yes.
Does it change the quality to see that compared to when it's an imputer?
Yeah, when you're abandoning the imputation and going into the identity of someone that's doing that, then it just looks like it's true. We might call it, we might say we're imputing, but we also might feel like, yeah, but it's also true what we're thinking or imputing or believing in or guessing at. Yes?
Do we receive imputations?
You mean your own?
Like we receive thoughts, do we receive that imputation?
Yes, I think so. I think I know what you're asking, but I would say that the best way to look at it is that you're receiving it. The best thing is just to receive everything. receive rather than produce. Produce if you have to, but try to receive as much as possible. That way we really get to know ourselves, because we start to have thoughts that we're no longer going to object to our negativity or our fear. We're going to actually be that way. We're going to actually have those negative feelings or thoughts, rather than try to pull ourselves out of it. It's interesting that by being able to do that, you also can cheer yourself up at the same time. Well, it's not two. There's not two things. So if you're doing this, the other part of it is always available. I'm sorry to be so clear. It's not really apologizing. My stepfather used to say, never apologize. And I remember thinking, no, never apologize. I never got a chance to really interrogate him about that, what he meant. I think it was because he thought he was always right, maybe, or something. I don't know. We're at the end of our calamity. Jane, you have a further question? Aren't you the Shuso? Aren't you the head? Should you have some kind of a question? Good. Questions are hard. Thank you, my friends.
We'll stand and dedicate the merit in the back of our chant books. I'd like to remind everybody about the donation boxes in the hallway. Also, we receive donations online through PayPal. You can also take your debit or credit card. And if you are in the Marshall Battle Creek area next week, a week from tomorrow, July 11th at 7 p.m., Sokuzan will be giving a talk on meditation at the Mitten Word Bookstore. Please join us if you can.
Mitten meditation.
May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Ji-o san chi chi bu, chi son mu sa mo ko sa, mo ko ja o mi. The 10 directions, the 3 worlds, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita. O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect SokukoJi Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.